In 1811, the son of a Ruhr Valley merchant opened a small cast steel factory west of a town of barely 3,000 people. And it failed so completely that for years it could barely keep a single furnace running, let alone turn a profit. 70 years later, the company built from that failure was arming the German Empire, employing tens of thousands of men across an entire valley, and manufacturing some of the most feared artillery on the planet, guns that European militaries measured their own weapons against. By the middle of the Second World War, that same company was doing both of those things, arming a nation and dominating a region's economy, using the forced labor of prisoners of war and people transported directly from concentration camps to keep its furnaces running, while German men were sent to the front. Today, the site most associated with that same family's industrial empire, once the largest coal mine on Earth, hosts a design museum, a public ice rink built among the old coke ovens, and a Ferris wheel that turns slowly above what used to be one of the most productive and most feared industrial complexes in Europe. This is Essen, in Germany's Ruhr Valley, and its story runs directly through a single family name that most of the world still associates, for very good reason, with weapons rather than with steel wheels or railway track. The mechanism here isn't subtle, and it isn't really about the coal or the steel at all, not underneath. It's about how completely a city's identity can be captured by one family's ambition, and how long it takes to build a new identity once that family's legacy becomes something the world would rather forget. Essen existed for nearly 1,000 years before any of this began. Founded around the 9th century as the site of a women's abbey, established under the patronage of a Hildesheim bishop named Alfred, and it stayed a quiet religious and market town for centuries afterward, its fortunes tied to farming, salt trading, and the abbey's modest regional influence rather than to industry of any kind. Pilgrims and traders passed through on established routes, but nothing about the place suggested it would ever matter to anyone beyond the immediate valley. As late as 1802, the entire settlement held roughly 3,000 people, a number that would have made it unremarkable anywhere in Germany, a town smaller than dozens of others nobody remembers today. What changed everything was what lay beneath the surrounding fields. Seams of coal close enough to the surface to be mined with the technology of the era, and a river system, the Ruhr itself, capable of moving heavy cargo out toward the Rhine and from there to the wider industrializing world. The man who turned that raw geological advantage into an industrial dynasty was Friedrich Krupp, whose family had lived in Essen since an ancestor named Arndt Krupp arrived from the Netherlands and joined the local merchants' guild back in 1587, building his own fortune over the following decades through real estate and trade rather than manufacturing. Friedrich founded a cast steel factory in 1811 and built a new works just outside the town in 1818, gambling that Germany's scattered principalities, still politically fragmented and technologically behind, needed a reliable domestic source of the high-quality cast steel then only available from British manufacturers who guarded their production methods closely. The gamble nearly ruined him. Transport connections to the new factory were poor, the small Bern River running past it too shallow for reliable shipping most of the year, and the operation stayed marginal for years, employing only a handful of men producing molds for coin minting rather than anything ambitious. Friedrich Krupp died in 1826 with the company still deep in debt, its founder having never lived to see it succeed, leaving the struggling business to his teenage son Alfred, who had left school at 14 to work the furnaces himself rather than complete any formal education. Alfred Krupp turned out to be one of the most relentless industrialists of the 19th century, and the timing broke decisively in his favor at almost every turn. In 1834, the German states formed a customs union called the Zollverein, dismantling internal tariff barriers and opening a genuine domestic market for the first time in the country's fractured history, and Alfred rushed to sell Krupp steel across it before his competitors could establish themselves. When German railroads began expanding rapidly through the 1840s and 1850s, Krupp supplied the steel for their wheels and axles, developing a seamless railway wheel that became an industry standard across Europe. And when Prussia and the other German states began modernizing their armies in earnest, Krupp supplied artillery, cast entirely in steel rather than the bronze most European militaries still relied on, a material advantage that made Krupp guns noticeably more reliable and more powerful than almost anything else on the market. By the time of Alfred's death in 1887, the company that had once struggled to keep one furnace lit employed roughly 20,000 people, and Alfred himself had earned a nickname that stuck to the family for the rest of its history, the Cannon King, a title he apparently wore with considerable pride. The growth from there was staggering and almost entirely tied to Europe's escalating appetite for weapons and rail infrastructure alike. Krupp guns armed the Prussian victories that unified Germany in 1871. Guns whose reputation for reliability under fire spread across European general staffs almost as quickly as the empire itself. Krupp steel built the framework of a rapidly industrializing Ruhr Valley, where Essen's population climbed from that original 3,000 toward hundreds of thousands within a single lifetime, drawing miners and steelworkers from across Germany and beyond into a landscape of pit heads, coking plants, and dense workers' housing that spread for miles along the valley floor, smokestacks replacing church spires as the skyline's defining feature. The centerpiece of it all became the Zollverein coal mine, named after that same customs union that had first opened Alfred Krupp's markets, which by the 20th century had grown into the largest and most productive coal mine anywhere on Earth. Its distinctive twin-towered winding house, built in the clean geometric style of the Bauhaus movement, eventually celebrated as a masterpiece of industrial design rather than merely a functional piece of mining infrastructure. The Krupp family itself moved into Villa Hugel, an enormous English-style estate of 269 rooms overlooking an artificial lake the family had built specifically to complete the setting. A residence built to announce, in stone and landscaped parkland, that a Ruhr Valley industrial dynasty now belonged among Europe's genuine aristocracy, rather than merely its merchant class. That ascent led directly to the darkest chapter of the family's history, and it cannot be left out of any honest account of this city, however uncomfortable it remains. Krupp weapons armed Germany through the First World War, cannons bearing the family name shelling the trenches of the Western Front. When the Second World War arrived, the company, now run by Alfred Krupp, Alfred's grandson, became one of the Third Reich's most important arms manufacturers. Its factories converted almost entirely to military production, turning out artillery, U-boat components, and tank parts around the clock. To keep those factories running as German men were conscripted to the front in ever greater numbers, Krupp used the forced labor of prisoners of war and, from 1943 onward, prisoners transported directly from concentration camps, including a subcamp built specifically to house laborers for Krupp's own operations near the main works. Conditions in that labor system were documented after the war as brutal, even by the standards of the Third Reich's other forced labor programs. In 1948, an American military tribunal convicted Alfred Krupp of war crimes and crimes against humanity for that forced labor system, sentencing him to 12 years in prison and ordering the confiscation of his entire industrial empire, a punishment that briefly made him one of the most visible symbols of German industrial complicity in the Nazi war machine. He served barely 3 years of that sentence. In 1951, amid growing Cold War pressure to rebuild West German industrial capacity as a bulwark against the Soviet bloc, the American High Commissioner for Germany pardoned Krupp, restored his confiscated property in full, and returned him to the head of the very company his forced laborers had kept running throughout the war. The city around all of this paid its own separate price, because Krupp's factories made Essen one of the most valuable military-industrial targets in Germany. Allied bombers returned to the city again and again through the war, and by 1945 large sections of Essen had been reduced to rubble, its factories, its housing, and much of its historic core destroyed in raids specifically aimed at ending Krupp's production capacity for good. Even after the post-war rebuilding, which patched over the physical destruction faster than anyone expected, decline arrived again a generation later, more slowly this time but just as thoroughly. and it's worth separating out exactly what compounded across those following decades. Cheaper imported coal and oil undercut Ruhr coal's competitiveness from the 1960s onward, making deep, expensive German mining increasingly uneconomical compared to fuel arriving by sea from producers with none of the Ruhr's geological or labor costs. Global steel overcapacity through the 1970s and 1980s hit Ruhr steelmakers just as hard as it hit Bilbao's mills at almost exactly the same moment on the other side of Europe, as cheaper production elsewhere in the world undercut prices no German mill could match. Automation reduced the number of workers even the mines that stayed open actually needed, breaking the direct link between a working pit and a stable local job market that had held for over a century. And the Krupp name itself, once a source of civic pride stamped proudly on gun barrels and railway wheels alike, had become permanently entangled with its wartime record, complicating the family firm's ability to operate as a standalone symbol of German industry the way it once had, an image problem no amount of post-war investment could fully undo. By 1986, after 135 years of continuous operation, the Zollverein mine pulled its final shift of coal to the surface and went silent for good. In 1999, what remained of the Krupp steel business merged with its old rival Thyssen to form ThyssenKrupp, ending, on paper at least, the family name's solo run atop German industry. Essen's answer to all of this took nearly 2 decades to fully take shape, but it borrowed a lesson other struggling industrial cities across Europe were learning at almost exactly the same time, in Bilbao and elsewhere. Turn the ruins themselves into the attraction, rather than demolishing them and pretending the industrial past never happened. In 2001, the closed Zollverein complex was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its coking plant and winding towers preserved and restored rather than demolished for scrap, and redevelopment the way so much other industrial heritage across Europe had already been lost. The former boiler house now holds the Red Dot Design Museum, showcasing contemporary industrial design inside the very machinery that once processed coal around the clock. A deliberate irony that curators seem entirely aware of. Visitors skate through the winter months on an outdoor ice rink built directly among the old coke ovens and ride a slow-turning Ferris wheel above buildings that once ran continuously, choking the valley with smoke so thick that residents reportedly kept their windows shut even in summer. In 2010, Essen was named European Capital of Culture, a title shared that year with several other cities, but claimed by Essen on behalf of the entire Ruhr region, one of the first times an industrial conurbation, rather than a single glamorous city centre, had won the honour. In 2017, remarkably for a city built entirely on coal and steel, Essen was named European Green Capital, honoured specifically for reclaiming former industrial land as parkland faster than almost anywhere else in Germany. Villa Hugel, the Krupp family's 269-room monument to their own success, is no longer a private residence at all. The Allies confiscated it after the war and used it as a control commission headquarters until 1952, and when it was finally returned to the family, they chose not to move back in, opening it instead to the public for cultural exhibitions and concerts, a choice that reads, deliberately or not, as a quiet admission that the private dynasty chapter of this story was genuinely, permanently over. Essen today employs almost nobody in coal and almost nobody in steel, a total reversal from the city Alfred Krupp once ran his arms empire out of, its economy now built on services, logistics, and a tourism trade that would have baffled anyone who worked these valleys a century ago. What survived instead was the physical infrastructure of that ambition, repurposed rather than demolished. A coal mine that once armed a war machine standing quietly today as one of the most visited industrial landmarks in the world, its winding towers now watched by tourists with cameras rather than miners heading down for the next shift. The furnaces that Friedrich Krupp nearly bankrupted himself trying to keep lit in 1818 are long gone, scrapped decades ago along with almost everything else from that first failed factory. What remains of the family's name survives mostly in a hyphenated corporate logo, a historical archive maintained by their own foundation, and a villa nobody in the family lives in anymore. Its 269 rooms now more likely to host a design conference than a dynasty. The valley that armed 2 world wars now minds nothing at all. And the loudest sound most afternoons at Zollverein is the scrape of ice skates across a rink built where coal wagons used to run.